catch me, I'm at half speed. I got your girl and she laughing and dancing. Yeah, let's go. I ain't the first with the curse, with the thirst that I wanna be better, not worse, man it hurts. I'm on this earth with my words and I put them all together, insert, cause I wanna have worth. Working hella hard till they put me in the dirt. Gonna go far, man, listen to my words. Gonna be a star, man, life's like a blur. When you're working this hard, yeah, you get what you deserve. Yeah, I ain't taking a backseat, I'm passing anybody else who is rapping. I'm nasty, ain't nobody able to catch me. They gasping, they cannot compare, they can't match me. I'm at half speed, I got your girl and she laughing and dancing, hanging on my butt, she asking to crash with me, smash with me, she savage, she wants cash money, and she knows that I live lavishly, I wanna live, I'm cold inside, give all I have just to feel alive, I fight to live, I fight to strive, one day I'll have what I want. I want the whole world in the palm of my hand, I got a plan, I'm the man, now I'm teaching the game, a veteran, better than anybody else who tests me, I'm ready, looking in my hand and it's steady, ascending and blending, lyrical bending, now I'm spreading and getting my name out now, yeah.
Yo. All right, so let's see who comes back after me doing an early version of the Secret Sermon. I am going to apologize for the sound earlier, but things should be working now. I do want to, before we start, I always mention this Bible. Wait, where is it? There it is. Okay. I always mention this Bible, and so people know what it is. So it says the CTS New Catholic Bible. If you look up New Catholic Bible now, it's one from India. This is not from India. I believe this one is from New Zealand, and I was going to say the UK. New Zealand and AU from Australia is the one that they used there, or did use there as a Catholic. I really love this translation. It's basically just the New Jerusalem Bible with God's name replaced with Lord and God. And it is very nice. And also, I think it used the Grail Psalms. I really, really, really like this Bible. It is my favorite Catholic Bible. My second favorite Catholic Bible is the New American. New American you can still find, and it's in print. This one you can only find on Amazon, and once it's gone, it's gone. But this is my favorite translation of the Bible. It is not the most accurate. I want to be very clear. It's just very poetic, and it's very poetic English, and I really enjoy it a lot. And a lot of times when I do my readings, the UK Divine Office and the American Liturgy of the Hours, they're both the same thing. But one's by Collins UK. Collins UK uses this translation for their liturgy. So I often like to read a passage in both, and it actually gives you a much better and much fuller understanding of what you're reading. So sometimes if I'm confused about something or something seems very deep to me, but I want to understand it better, I will read this version and the New American Bible version, and it really does help. Okay. So now let's get to the watch together. I really want to watch this, but I think it would be kind of snipey to do someone else's live stream on this live stream. So, anyway, Gospel of Simplicity. For those that are watching my secret sermons, how are you guys liking them? Are they good? Are they not good? What do you think about them?
People who we can claim as our own in a sense as well. And then there's also figures like...
My only problem is how soft he
trends
speaks.
For me.
It's my only problem with him is that he speaks way too softly. It does actually bother me.
Within Protestantism in recent times has been the excitement around church history. It's something that is especially seen on my channel and the kind of corners of the internet that you...
Well, it's partially because the old form of evangelical Christianity that revolved only around the Bible is completely self-destructed. they couldn't maintain hermeneutic consistency between denominations. So it was a real problem. So I'm glad that they're looking at the history of the Bible now, at the Church Fathers' interpretations. But that does bring them closer to Catholicism and Orthodoxy. So, and that is a problem. There's even a New York Times article about this, where as Protestants, evangelicals, fundamentalists are discovering the Church Fathers, they're leaving evangelicalism for Catholicism, and in much larger numbers for Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy.
Probably inhabit if you watch my videos. And this happens on multiple levels. It's not just on the theological level, but also on the devotional or spiritual level. What I mean by this is we have figures like Dr. Gavin Ortland, who has done a lot around theological retrieval for evangelicals. That's one of the titles of his books, right? But the idea that we should be going back to the theology of the fathers to enrich our theology and to see them as people who we can claim as our own in a sense as well. And then there's also figures like John Mark Comer, who with his Practicing the Way and several of his books has really been delving into the spirituality of the early church and encouraging evangelicals to experience it themselves. And I think this is all fantastic. And these are both people individually and movements more generally that I've personally benefited from. However, I was recently reading an article from a former guest on the show, Dr. Brad East, who I had a wonderful time talking to, and it's a great article, I'll link it below, in which he remarked that all of his students are reading John Mark Comer. And he's like, what's going on here? And he was excited to see that these students were interested in fasting and they were interested in spiritual disciplines. He's like, this is great. I've got to read this guy. And he didn't have high hopes. He thought he'd maybe be kind of like celebrity pastor vibe.
We also might watch a little bit of what your pastor didn't tell you, of his video on the Gospels special by Dr. Jordan Peterson. I'm listening to that series and I have opinions and I wanted to put something together. But if he already put something together, I can just put my commentary over his commentary. That's fine.
But he got into him and he's seeing him quote Evagrius and St. John of the Cross and the Cappadocian Fathers and thinking, wow, this is really substantial. But he noticed that one thing was missing from this writing about the early church. And I think a lot of people also, when they look at the theological side, they say, wow, this seems good, but something seems to be missing. I know that's been my own experience, whether it's on the theological side of retrieving the theology of the church fathers, or it's on the spiritual side of, over the last year, my wife and I have gone through his Practicing the Way curriculum. And it's been great for us. But there's this sinking suspicion that something isn't being said. And that's what I want to talk about in this video, specifically some of the challenges that evangelicals and low church Protestants face when they try to retrieve church history and to find in the church fathers people that they can call their own and people that they can fashion their lives and their practice of faith after. Okay, so let's start on the theological level. When I think about this, I'm taken back to a comment that my dear friend Keith Little, he hosts the Cordial Catholic podcast, which is a wonderful show. He said to me, and he also said it.
By the way, I have another Tanakh that I was thinking about bringing out here. It's by the Koren Institute, but I went with the Art Scroll, for those who are wondering, as my background.
In an interview with Dr. Ortland as well, and it's been a question that I haven't been able to get out of my head for the past 4 or 5 years.
Oh, I just want to say I've officially stopped reading the Book of Mormon. Maybe I'll finish it one day, maybe hopefully this coming year. But right now I am reading Gavin Ortland's book, Why We Are Protestant, and I'm reading Jordan Peterson's book, We Who Wrestle with God, and reviews for those will be coming in the future, assuming I'm here.
And it was a simple one. The question was simply, which of the church fathers could be a pastor at your church? Because for all
Ooh, that is a good question. The closest one I could think of would be John Christensen. But the fact that you don't have the Eucharist, the fact that you don't have holy water, the fact that you don't have incense, he would hate all of that. And that you don't have liturgy. I mean, his liturgy is one of the most famous liturgies in the world. So, yeah, that would be a problem.
we have about learning from the church fathers and wanting to be in continuity with them, right? And have this organic connection to the past and a rootedness in tradition, even as Protestants. This question puts a pin on it that is very difficult because for most of us, and I don't want to misrepresent Gavin, but to the best of my ability, I remember him essentially answering similarly as I'm going to here, is that not many, maybe none. And you might be thinking, well, that sounds extreme. I mean, certainly we're learning a lot from these people, right? Like, couldn't they be a pastor? But when you think about what it would take to be a pastor.
Well, first off, most of them are priests. So that would be a problem for you because they're Catholic priests. So that would really put a damper on your relationship. And then those who were not were monastics and monks. And for the desert mothers and for the church mothers, most of them were nuns. So, yeah, you're going to have a problem.
at your church? Do they sign your doctrinal statement? Do they agree with your ecclesiology, your sacramentology? Do they agree with, what would they think of your liturgy? When you add all these things together, maybe they'd be okay with one thing or another, right? Maybe you can read the Cappadocians and discover incredible insights into Trinitarian theology. Maybe you can read Athanasius and think, wow, like my Christology is so much deeper and I can resonate with this. Or you read Augustine and you think, oh, what he's talking about faith here, yes, that makes so much sense to me. But can you incorporate all of any of these men into your theology? Can you incorporate how they view the church, the sacraments? That's where it gets a lot more complicated.
How they view authority and hierarchy.
Questions around what we mean by, are we retrieving the church? Can we really call them ours? Now, you're left with a couple options here when you run into this question specifically, which church father could teach at your church, if any. So one thing you could say is, well, no church father could teach at my church, but at least the apostles could, which is essentially like a type of sola scriptura, but it kind of sneaks in this idea of like a great apostasy, right? Where none of the church fathers until Luther, and well, probably not even Luther, but none of them could teach at your church. And when I talk to people who are interested in historical theology, most really want to avoid this kind of theory of the great apostasy, a great falling away. But it's hard to not see a little bit of that when we say none of them could teach there. Now, there is another option, though. And the other option is to say, look, yeah, maybe none of them could teach at my church. And again, talking about kind of low church, evangelical, maybe Baptist settings here. But you'd say, man, I don't think they could teach at any modern church. Now, this leaves you with kind of two ways of taking that. The first would be, again, kind of like a great apostasy type thing. Like, hey, all the churches today just look different than the early church. And that's just what it is. And the early church was wrong, and the churches today were right, perhaps, or maybe some of them are right today. I think the more common, though, path that you would take with this requires you to accept a certain form of doctrinal development in which you say, okay, so maybe they have some different emphases or whatnot, but they could teach in my church. Now, at this point, I do want to say where Protestants are coming from when they say, I don't think they could teach at any modern church. This is kind of the route that I think Dr. Ortlund takes in a lot of his material, because they say, sure, like our theology might be slightly different than the church fathers, but so is yours. And they say, like, would the ante-Nicene fathers be okay with your Mariology or your veneration of icons? And if Catholics answer, well, maybe not, okay, so we're back at development of doctrine, right? Which is fine. But we have to recognize what's going on there. Or Catholic or Orthodox.
I disagree with that take. Most of them would be okay with the icons.
Could say, no, I do think the ante-Nicene fathers would be okay with these things. And then that's where you get into these historical debates, which have taken up a lot of airtime on YouTube and gotten a lot of views, and is stuff I talk about on my channel and Dr. Ortlund talks about on his. Now, it's worth noting at this point, though, when we're talking about kind of continuity and discontinuity with the fathers, there does seem to be differences in degree here. So even if you grant that modern Orthodox theology or modern Catholic theology differs from the fathers in certain places, there's still a question of who bears a greater resemblance, right? And I think that most people, not all, but most would say that the fathers generally resemble these two traditions a little more, the Catholic and Orthodox, than they do anything that looks like a kind of low church Protestant. In other words, the fathers would probably feel a lot more at home in those traditions than they would at your local Baptist, evangelical.
I mean, heck, if they go to a traditional Latin Mass, they're going to be okay. If they go to a traditional Greek language Mass, they're going to be okay. It's only in the vernacular that they might be a little off. And even then, you give them a translation, they might be able to follow. My cat opened the door by itself, and she didn't come in. And that is spooky. She figured out how to open my door. Oh, there she is. Now she hopped in. She opened the door and didn't come in. That was something else. Oh my goodness. Anyway, let's continue.
Denominational church or liberal mainline church for that matter. But there's another important question here. And in some ways, this is like the question. And it's, even if we grant that there's some development here, how would the church fathers, these people that we all want to claim, that we all want to learn from, that we all want to say we're in connection with, how would they judge the developments that came later? Now, these are difficult questions, right? Because we don't know for sure. I mean, we can't take Augustine to the 15th century or the 16th century. We can't take the Cappadocians and bring them to the 10th century, right? Like, these things aren't possible, but we can get glimpses of this. And the question that it really is how would they measure them? Specifically, would they take an approach of, well, does it align with the scripture, going with kind of a sola scriptura principle here, because scripture is our ultimate authority, so we're going to test these doctrines by scripture, or are we going to test them more with the living tradition of the church, seen through the authority of the councils or maybe the Pope, right? That's the question we have to ask. And I really think that almost all ecumenical disagreements come down to two things, and that's one of them. A future video will talk about the other. But I think if you want to investigate something, that's probably the thing to investigate. But in summary, the challenge on the theological side is that while we can be inspired by the church fathers, it seems difficult to claim that any of the church fathers are truly our own, as there are too significant of disagreements that we have with them, as illustrated by the fact, the uncomfortable fact, that maybe none of them.
Thomas, it is, and I've seen it, and I don't know why. I don't. My channel's not the most controversial religious channel, and it's not the most controversial commentary channel. So I don't know why. But yeah, I know. I see it. I see it. I see it.
Them could be pastors in your church. Okay, but what about the spiritual practice side? Someone like John Mark Comer, and this gets back to that article that Dr. Brad East wrote. And so, on the surface, surely there's nothing wrong with the way Comer and other Christians are calling Protestants back to more ancient practices of fast.
That is why I have a completely separate channel that's not a secondary channel that's not tied to these emails, just to see how that one does on its own. It's not doing great either, but I haven't seen any throttling over there. So yeah, I can definitely see the contrast between this one and that one.
Fasting and ways of prayer and generosity and other things like this. But here's where things get tricky once again. So it's not so much that what we find in these things, the things they're positively claiming that we should do, are bad. I think that aligns with the early church. These are good things. It's rather the surprising lack of one thing. It's that in Comer's, I think it's like 9 practices in practicing the way, and for all of his emphasis on the early church, the one thing you don't find is the sacraments. And why is that? Well, it's probably because most modern sacramental theology coming out of Protestant churches, specifically low church Protestants, well, it's not even sacramental, right? They wouldn't even talk about these as means of grace. But this is such a big point for the early church. I mean, I don't think it's
Even my secret sermons, which are unpromoted and don't have any tags in them, are doing sometimes better than these watch-alongs. So, yeah. And my debate reviews usually get 1,000 views within one day, and this one has not broken 100 yet. So, no, I can see it in my stats, man.
the controversial idea to say that the Eucharist was central to the early church in their spirituality and in their experience of following Christ. And not only was it the Eucharist, but this was a very ecclesially focused Eucharist. I mean, if you read Ignatius, the way he ties bishop and Eucharist together, you get to really uncomfortable places. But again, I think we're maybe being just a little...
Hear that again.
Focused Eucharist. I mean, if you read Ignatius, the way he ties bishop and Eucharist together, you get to really uncomfortable places. But again, I think we're maybe being just...
So again, these are Catholic priests and these are Catholic bishops. And Catholic here doesn't mean the Roman Catholic Rite. It means the universal church, the church that at that time probably would have been the patriarchate, the full whole church. So with each of its patriarchs. So yeah, so I think there's a lot that's being missed here by the Protestants, even by someone who's as alerted to the issue at hand as gospel simplicity. His bias toward Protestantism means that he can't acknowledge certain truths, at least not on air, without losing his audience. So there's some audience capture going here as well.
a little... I don't want to say disingenuous, because that implies that we're trying to hide something. But I think as Protestants go back to the early church to try to retrieve things, there is a sense of you can't take it all because it doesn't all fit in that way. Now, you can have a higher view of the Eucharist, but can you have that high view of the Eucharist in the way that they did? This is where it gets tricky. What we see in the early church is you find an emphasis on fasting with the church, praying the church's words, receiving the sacrament.
For those of you who watch my stuff regularly, even the big guys, and I know that I'm not trying to pressure some of the bigger people that watch my channel into promoting me in this way. But if you want to help my channel out, if you really think it's worth watching, you need to share my videos, man, because the algorithm is not helping me. It's really not. I don't want to say it's against me. I don't want to sound paranoid, but it really does throttle my views. I see people get booted out of my watch streams all the time. I see comments getting, even great comments getting suppressed and deleted by YouTube. I'm not the one yeeting them, even though that's old terminology. Who knows what the current terminology is? But so if you guys want to help me out, comment, like, and subscribe. I know that sounds really trite at this point on YouTube's in the lifespan of YouTube, but sharing my videos really would help. Like I said, I'm not trying to pressure anyone. I know there's some much bigger names that come through my channel. I'm not trying to pressure you into helping me out, but if you wanted to, it is by sharing my videos. That would really, that would do my channel a world of good, because an audience that's watching, YouTube can't deny that. They can deny the subscribers. They can unsubscribe as many people as they want, but actual views, that just counts. That just helps.
In the church by duly ordained ministers in communion with the bishop. This is tough stuff, right? And so as Protestants, we find once again an ecclesiology rearing its head in objection to our continuity with the early church. Okay, so paths forward, because I'm a Protestant, so what am I saying all this for, right? This is messy. Okay, so what can Protestants do? On the one hand, I've intentionally focused on low church expressions because these have, in my opinion, the most tension with the early church. They have they're at odds the most with the witness that we see from the fathers, especially as we get into kind of like the patristic golden age, if you will, of the 4th and 5th centuries.
I agree.
It's often remarked on my friend, who I love, Gavin Ortland's videos, but it's often remarked on his videos that it seems that sometimes when he's making more positive cases for Protestantism, it's an argument for something like Anglo-Catholicism, or maybe...
Also, he denies a lot of the connections that he doesn't like because it hurts his argument. Holy smokes. I'll be right back. I'm going to get a Kleenex. Give me a second. Sorry about that. Okay, where were we?
A Lutheranism, although he's a Baptist who attends a non-denominational church, and people can be confused by that. To be fair, I think he's just showing that these things can exist within Protestantism, but I do think if you're trying to look for a path forward and you want to say, I want to be in continuity with the fathers, well, it probably, and you want to stay Protestant, it probably does look like something like becoming Anglo-Catholic. That's probably your best bet. However, there's an important thing to recognize, and it gets back to that kind of critical question. By the time you've made that move to become Anglo-Catholic, you might have given up, or at least thoroughly massaged, your idea of sola scriptura as the heartbeat of the Protestant Reformation. Or at least you've limited it, right, by focusing more on continuity with the tradition. And once you...
I think it works very simply. I don't think this is a hard statement or even controversial. If you believe that the Pope is the rock, you believe that he's the foundation of the church, then, or the cornerstone of the church, I should say, and Jesus is the foundation, well, then you're going to end up choosing Catholicism. If you believe that sola scriptura is true, you're going to be a Protestant of some type. If you don't believe that the Bible stories are real, are truth, then you're going to be a woke or progressive Christian. And if you believe that ancient liturgy is the key, that liturgy is your high point, then you're going to be Orthodox. I just think that's how it has to be. I think those are the dividing lines.
You've made that decision, which is a fine thing to do. I think you have to recognize, though, you are kind of moving away from the Reformation in many ways, or at the very least, moving away from the ways the Reformation has been received historically. And so if you want to stay Protestant...
I say move away from the Reformation. It is a terrible thing. Get away from the Reformation. You'll be fine.
Might look like becoming something that looks significantly less Protestant than you're used to. Maybe that's a better Protestantism. Maybe that's even a more faithful Protestantism. Those are all...
The fact that a lot of Protestants aren't even willing to call themselves Protestant anymore, even though they're still in a Protestant denomination, tells you a lot. Just move away from Protestantism. Move away from sola scriptura. You're going to be fine. You're going to survive.
Good questions, but I do think it will require change. The other option, of course, is you could become Catholic or Orthodox if you find their continuity claims compelling and you think continuity of the fathers over against maybe what your understanding of sola scriptura and using the scripture as it. And again, if you've become convinced, you probably think these things go together, but maybe you've kind of changed your paradigm and you think, yeah, I want to be in continuity with the fathers. I want to have this organic connection. And I think the fathers would have deemed maybe these things that develop later on as genuine and accepted the authority of the church. Cool. That's an option for you. But finally, I think one option too for Protestants is to simply be a little bit more modest. I love that there's a lot of emphasis on retrieving historical theology. I want people to do that. I personally found so much life in doing that. But I think we have to be a little honest about what we're doing. Early on in the Reformation, you'd see Calvin making claims like we're just going back to the church of the first.
I'm going to be doing a review of Trent Horn versus a Protestant in Rome, which that's a hard choice to make, but he made it. The review, again, it's one of these non-formal debates, so it's from Unbelievable. I'm gonna probably write the script tomorrow. I'll probably have it up on Sunday. I should have done it last week, but I've been distracted with trying to get things rolling on a thing I got to do with my wife. So
4 centuries. I think that might be a little bit of a stretch. I think what we see throughout history is that claim kind of falls off a little bit, and it becomes more of, okay, we're in line with the Church of the Apostles, because pretty quickly you're going to see things that get uncomfortable fast. I'm making a video.
And you're not in line with the Church of the Apostles either. You guys have a lot of stuff that's not biblical. You think it's biblical because you're viewing it through an ultra-literalist lens, but a lot of the connections you're making, you're filling in gaps with your own ideas. How to Be Christian is really good at pointing this out. I think he's the best Catholic apologist out there that's pointing this out, is that for you to make things work, for Protestants to make things work, they're filling in the gaps with dogma that was defined by the Catholic Church. So it doesn't make sense what you all are doing. You guys have to either admit that you're using Catholic dogma to fill in the gaps, or you have to admit that you're wrong.
On St. Cyril soon. While St. Cyril's challenging to everyone, if you want to receive Cyril, you're going to get this very high ecclesiology, you're going to get prayers to the dead, and this is 4th century. This is his kind of commentary on the creed. What do we do with that? So do we want to say we're in continuity with him, or we have to go back even further? So I think one of the options for Protestants, and this is uncomfortable, and you have to decide if you're going to remain Protestant, if you're okay with this kind of thing, but is to say, hey, we're going to retrieve the best of the fathers. We're going to retrieve what we think is scripturally warranted, but ultimately we can't take all of it. In which case, and maybe this is too bold, but the church fathers become less like a father with whom you have this organic connection and more like a church uncle, maybe a church stepfather. I don't know what metaphor you want to use there.
It would be church brother, but you didn't get there. So 1 point subtracted from gospel simplicity's word game.
On shaky ground. But I do think that while we absolutely should learn as much as we can from the fathers, at some point a Protestant will have to decide, is my main goal to be in organic continuity with the fathers? Is that even possible? Does anyone have that? And if it is that, is that more important to me than maintaining this kind of posture of sola scriptura? And if you say yes to those things, you're probably not going to remain Protestant. I'm not losing sleep over that personally, but these are just some things to consider. I'm glad people are...
Okay, let's move on to something else. Let's see, what do we got? Let's see. Hey, look. There I am. Let's see. Let's watch a little bit more of this, and then we'll move on to a different
controversy and the development of the Nicene Creed. I really enjoyed that video. And it's a similar example of like Arius comes along and says, you know what, I think Jesus is really, really great, but he's not God. And he has good arguments behind him, good biblical arguments. As you pointed out, he's in some ways a closer reader of the literal sense of Scripture than his opponents. And in some ways, he's more traditional. He's like, we're monotheists, come on. How can we say Jesus is God and yet the Father is God? Again, I think these days, if that sort of thing happened these days, what could you do? All you'd be able to do is to say, well, let's just agree to disagree on this. We all agree that Jesus is great. That's the central thing that unites us. Whether you think that Jesus is God or not, just take your pick. But that's not what they did back then.
Yeah.
They had a council, and at the council they decided, actually, we're going to make a decision here that in order to count as a Christian and still be a part of this church, you have to believe that Jesus is God, and if you want to reject the council's decision on that, you're out. Now, what do you think, from the perspective of this ecumenical question, why was there a need for a council? Why not just theological argument?
Yeah, I think it starts with the idea that unity or uniformity in belief is really important, which I think most Christians would grant, but I think it's important to note that that's kind of one of the underlying things here.
Yeah.
And I think the next thing is that, okay, if we need that, theological argument doesn't seem to be getting us there because we can't get people to agree because, and this might be a controversial opinion among Protestants, I would grant that, like...
Oh, they cut him off. That's different. They didn't do that before. I'm going to get to Gavin Ortlund here, and then if we have time, we'll do these two here. So this is kind of speaking on what we just heard Gospel Simplicity speak on. Let's see how Gavin Ortlund's take on this is.
The New York Post ran an article recently entitled Young Men Leaving Traditional Churches for Masculine Orthodox Christianity in Droves. It quotes a survey.
So, technically speaking, they're leaving non-traditional churches for traditional churches. Just being honest with you, Gavin, the traditional church would be the Orthodox Church. I'm just saying, we're the older tradition, the Orthodox and the Catholics. I know, sweetheart, I hear you. You're upset because I won't let you sit on my lap. You can come sit on my lap. Come on. Come on. Come on.
Of Orthodox churches throughout the United States that notes a 78% increase in converts in 2022 compared with pre-pandemic levels in 2019. And the article also discusses a few other trends. One of them is it's mostly men, especially young men, who are being drawn into Eastern Orthodoxy. And also...
First off, he misspelled Ortlund. Secondly, he's not a doctor. Come on, let's be honest. Thirdly, he says pastor and author. He's a YouTuber.
The other thing is it's not slowing down. This is actually on the rise right now. I don't think this trend is going away. This is something we have to think about. Now, the goal of this video is not to give criticism of Eastern Orthodoxy or a detailed analysis of their theology or something like that. I've done that in various other videos on certain issues.
You haven't done it very well.
Like icon veneration, one big video a while back, a few more recently. I've talked a lot about their institute.
He has a really bad understanding of Eastern Orthodoxy. Yet, Eastern Orthodoxy has been very generous with him. I think they've been a little bit more generous with him and a little bit more charitable than the Catholics have, at least online.
Institutional exclusivism recently, a couple of videos on that. I've also done various debates and dialogues with Eastern Orthodox priests. And all that's important. But here I want to make a shorter, more pastoral video speaking to Protestants, especially evangelicals, who I think basically we need to pay attention to what's happening. I think we have a lot to learn here. So let's ask 3 questions. Number 1, why is this happening? Number 2, why does it matter? And number 3, what should we do about it? Before I dive in, I want to say a word about Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. I always want Truth Unites to support the local church. I hope my videos are not ever a replacement, but instead an encouragement to engage in church, but also seminaries and Christian colleges, other Christian institutions of learning of various kinds. And so I'm so thankful that Trinity Evangelical Divinity School is sponsoring this video. A lot of the people who watch my channel are wanting to grow in theology, be more thoroughly equipped as a follower of Jesus. So they're, always asking about book recommendations, how to read more. They're watching YouTube videos. Now, that I believe in that, but honestly, I think more people should consider formal theological education. This is one of the reasons I always want to encourage this. I think it's easier than you realize. Seminary is not just for pastors or for professors or something like that, and it's easier than ever. If you study at a place like TEDS is a leading evangelical seminary, wonderful place. I studied there for a year. I did a postdoctoral fellowship there. I also grew up in that area, so I know Trinity pretty well. It's a wonderful place. You get to be immersed in this vibrant community where you have not just a world-class faculty to teach you, but also an environment of other students, broadly evangelical. So you're committed, TEDS is committed to the authority of Scripture, but you get diversity within that on issues like baptism and things like this. And formal education can go a long way. It's just amazing. And it's easier than ever to do. You can do it online. You can do 8-week modular classes. They have different start dates. You can also do it, of course, in person. So I just really want to recommend people who want to go to the next step theologically, that's a great step to take, formal education. I've never regretted formal education. It always pays off. It's always a good investment. So check out, I'll put a link to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in the video description. All right, let's dive in and work through these 3 questions. First of all, why is this happening? Now, of course, every single conversion is different, but the article that I just referenced draws attention to 3 factors that are often at play. And it was so fascinating reading this article because it was so similar to conversations I've had, even down to the very wording. It was saying things that I felt and articulated. I'm realizing, it's not just me who's seeing this trend right now. 3 factors it draws attention to for why this is happening. Number 1 is the search for stability. Okay, people are hungry for tradition and rootedness and groundedness. People want something that isn't changing, something that feels permanent, like you're standing on a rock amidst the sea changes of the world. Everything about the world feels chaotic right now, and so people are.
Does it really?
Aching for a sense of stability. And Eastern Orthodoxy powerfully appeals to that need in the human heart. Even if we reject the thesis of them as a changeless church, that's what I've argued against, nonetheless, they do have this powerful sense of connection to the past, and people notice this.
I've noticed that Protestants of all stripes, Anglican, well, not so much Anglican, Baptists especially, seem to misunderstand what changelessness or what infallibility means, or I just noticed that they have a different understanding of these words than the Catholics and Orthodox do.
This one convert interviewed in the article said this: the hard thing about growing up in my church, that was an Anglican church, is that there was a lot of change even in my lifetime. Here's this: I realized that there really was no way to stop the change. Now that's quite a poignant sentiment right there. If we want to understand why a lot of people are leaving Protestantism, that's it in a nutshell. It's not just change, it's this sense of powerlessness in the face of the change. So the culture changes and we get swept up into the culture. This is why we got to think about this. This same person went on to say, I think there are a lot of Protestants who want a more traditional, grounded, historical faith. And I think for young people especially, it makes sense because so much else in our lives is changing all the time. He also expressed his sense of comfort in this aspect of Eastern Orthodoxy. There's a sense of structure, of continuity. It's the exact same. It hasn't changed. It's not going to change. Another convert said something very similar. I wanted to be somewhere that was stable and that wasn't going to change. It felt very ancient, and that was not something I had experienced elsewhere. This really struck me because just the other day, like literally maybe 5 days ago, my dad gave me an article I was reading. It was from someone who'd converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, and they were describing why they had made that change, and it was the exact same wording verbatim almost to that quote. It said, basically, they were saying, I wanted something that wasn't changing in the midst of a world that's constantly changing. You see why we got to think about this? Very relevant to the world right now. I mean, whatever you think about the theology and the differences here, there's like a sociological reality that all of us need to think about. Here's another testimony from the article to the exact same effect. Everything's changing. Protestant churches are changing. The Catholic Church is changing. The culture.
The aesthetics change, not the substance. Agreed. And the same thing with the Catholic Church. Gavin Ortlund's big attack against Catholicism is that we have accretions, which is just doctoral development, and his complaint against Orthodoxy is that, well, they do change. Well, Protestantism is changing all the time. So if you're not going to call your changes, then you can't call our developments changes. And if you're going to call our developments changes, then you have to call your developments changes. You can't have it both ways, Gavin. You either need to admit that everything changes, including Protestantism, and there's no stable ground in Christianity except faith in Jesus, or you have to admit that what Catholics and Orthodox call development of doctrine, Protestants are also subject to, even with Sola Scriptura.
Culture's changing. The government is changing. People want something that is historic and not going to change. They want something that's stable and sound.
Which is something I've heard you give, if not credence to, at least a mild acceptance to. So if you're willing to admit that already, I don't know why you're still fighting this, other than you want people in your church, not in our church, which is a bad way to think of it. It's all the body of Christ, man.
Not built on sand. We'll come back to that imagery of sand as opposed to rock.
Church.
When we talk
How you open your book, by the way.
In just a second, which has
how you open your book. One true Catholic church. Yeah, you open it with that phrase, okay? So you open it with the creed about the Catholic Church. So if you're admitting to it, then you have to submit to it as well. Santiago says, before you have a concrete system of icon veneration, you need to establish if Jesus is God and if the church is also spiritual, supernatural. Well, Catholics have a both-and approach. I'm not sure if Orthodox do both-and or if they do spiritual. But, yeah. I think they're both-and as well.
Same imagery reflected in its title, rock and sand. It's interesting in that quote as well, the reference to Catholicism. I actually know a lot of people like this. With everything going on with Pope Francis, Roman Catholicism is perceived to be like sand, just like Protestantism. These Western...
No. People have to stop framing Pope Francis like that. He's not making any major changes that haven't already been in development since like the 1980s. So it's all consistent with Vatican II. And when there's a new council, things will change again then. So, yeah, there's a misunderstanding here about everything. things are not shifting like sand. They're just not. They're just outgrowths of the original faith.
Eastern traditions are constantly changing, but in Eastern Orthodoxy, we have this stability and so forth. The other thing people, I think, are looking for that the article...
And the propaganda against Pope Francis is not Pope Francis is doing. Matt Fradd, Tyler Marshall, I don't know, the retrograde guy. These are the problems. They're YouTubers. They're not priests. And the bad cardinals and bad priests are being exiled out of the church. They're being defrocked. So just FYI, the church is healthy. The church is doing well. It's just a perception based on internet celebrities.
Draws attention to is a sense of rigor. Okay, this is part of the appeal to young men, and there's a lot of talk about masculinity in worship, which is interesting in this article. One convert described the sermons of their former Protestant setting as a TED Talk. Another compared the worship in their former Protestant setting to a rock concert. I thought that was fascinating because that's the exact same language I've used to criticize some evangelical practice. The article even...
I agree. I've gone to when I've sampled some Protestant churches, I've seen that problem as well.
Interviewed Jordan Peterson, who said this, and you could just imagine him saying it I wish I could impersonate him, but I won't try. Unlike a Protestant service, which is much more dependent on the preacher, you can't criticize an Orthodox service. Now listen to this. It's like going to a ballet and asking, what's going on here? Well, that's a stupid question. I have a lot of affection for him and his manner of speaking, and you can just imagine him saying, that's a stupid question. So funny. But I think Peterson's observation there is really insightful and interesting to think about, of the preacher versus the ballet. So ballet has a lot of different things going on, and it's all very orchestrated. That's his perception of how an Eastern Orthodox liturgy feels. Protestant settings put more pressure on one person, the preacher. I think that's true. So already we're starting to think and kind of maybe realize, what do we need to do about this? Maybe some ideas are coming to our minds. We'll speak to that in a moment. But here's one last factor that is not insignificant. Please give some patience to this. This is not something to look away from, and that's the realm of online apologetics. So I couldn't believe this. Again, it's like...
I just brought this up. I just said this a few seconds ago.
Reading this article is like, I think about this stuff all the time. It's like, oh, I'm not the only one who's seeing this. One of the catechists at Josiah Trenum's church out in California, Eastern Orthodox Church, I think in like the Riverside area, was quoted in the article as noting that their parish is full of young people, they're growing a lot right now, who are converting to Orthodoxy, and he attributed some of this to the internet. Quote, internet Orthodoxy is a recognized phenomenon. We get people who come in all the time who are like, I was on the internet and arguing with people and I discovered Orthodoxy and I found your church. That is not isolated. Okay, that happens a lot right now. Like it or not, here's, again, I'm trying to make an appeal here. This is a simple video in some ways, but people need to understand this. Like it or not, people go to the internet, and especially YouTube and podcasts and social media, for significant decisions in their life. Unfortunately,
For
even
some reason, this one doesn't have closed captioning. I wonder why.
TikTok has a big influence.
I wonder if it's
For
still
better
rendering on his end.
or for worse. That's a sociological reality. This is where conversations happen. People are influenced. That's why I do what I do here at Truth Unites.
I really should start doing some stuff on TikTok. I know. I don't want to.
I've become
I'm so
convinced that
old.
this is
I'm so old. I'll be the most ancient guy on TikTok.
a way to try to meet needs. And I feel a fatherly missiological burden to try to be a friend to young men, especially who are working through theology and have angst and so forth. So whatever that means, whatever you take from that, we need to be aware of that. And we need to think strategically about how do we meet the needs of the times right now. That's what I'm trying to do at Truth Unites. All right, second question. Why does this matter? I think sometimes people can be naive. This is why I try to speak to this. You'll hear parents, someone will have a child that becomes Eastern Orthodox when they go off to college. And
it's just me, or not his face, but like his eyes change, don't they? Like from week to week or month to month, he looks like a different person here. Like whatever's going on in his personal life, like it just reflects right here.
They'll say something, well, I'm just glad they're taking their faith seriously now. I've heard this kind of stuff. I think there's a lot of naivety about the differences between Eastern Orthodoxy and Protestantism. These are serious differences. Those of you who watch my channel know.
I thought you were all about ecumenicalism, my friend. What's going on with you? What happened to the triage?
I try to celebrate the common ground where we can, but also try to be honest about the differences. There's lots of ways to see how serious the divide.
It's like you had a very easy theory until you actually got into the trenches, and then you're like, oops, it's not as easy. BS says that's a demon. I see. Don't want to sound bad faith, but Eastern Orthodox does kind of attract a lot of these. Yes, but you have to understand that Eastern Orthodoxy is a nationalist religion. It's only in America where it's multi ethnic. In in traditional Orthodoxy, that's just a weird sentence to say, but in it's nationalistic. So you have the Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox, the Coptic Orthodox, meaning Egyptian, Syrian Orthodoxy. So it's all tied to the state that you are a member of. So you'll see the national flag with the Christian flag all the time in these churches. Catholic churches do that too, by the way. If you come to a church, to a Catholic church, you'll see the American flag, maybe sometimes the state flag, and you'll see a cross, a flag with a cross.
Divide is between Eastern Orthodox and Protestant, but one of the easiest is just to listen to what they say, to listen to how Eastern Orthodoxy categorizes Protestantism and treats Protestant converts in. Sometimes people have this naive idea that it's just a movement from one expression of Christianity to a richer and more historical expression of Christianity. But that's not that's not how the Eastern Orthodox Church understands it. You see that in Josiah Trenum's book. He's an Orthodox priest featured in this article, and he wrote this book, Rock and Sand, which I've read very carefully. I remember
Rock and Sand is a good book. Father Josiah is an amazing priest. If you're not subscribed to him, I recommend you subscribe to him today. He's great.
I thought of this book when I was reading the article because on page 153, he describes an exercise that he has his catechumens do. So if someone's coming into his church from a Protestant background, he explains that he has them write out on a sheet of paper 2 columns, heresies and errors on the one side and truth on the other. And he has them write out as thoroughly as possible what they are bringing from their Protestant background. What is heresy and what is true? And try to distinguish between that. And then he gives this rationale for that. Some catechumens are tempted to interpret their conversion to Holy Orthodoxy as a mere denominational switch and not what it is, a conversion from heresy to orthodoxy. Now, I think Trenum is correct there in how he's setting the stakes in terms of the historic and actual divide that is here. I don't agree with that assessment of what is the Orthodox view and what is the heretical.
I think you're admitting a little bit too much there, Gavin. But yeah, Gavin would view it the opposite way, I think.
View, but I appreciate that he's giving a historically authentic portrayal of the differences. And I'm making a simple point right now that I hope wouldn't be that controversial even, and needn't be, and that is, this is a serious divide. This is something to take really seriously. This is not, no one should think, oh, my child is converting to Eastern Orthodoxy. Okay, they're just getting a little different flavor of Christianity. That's not what the Orthodox say. And I've documented, this has been the focus of some of my recent videos. My most recent one, I invited people to give an answer to my question of basically just look at all these saints, look at these councils where it's been.
I haven't seen that video. Maybe tomorrow we'll do that video because Gavin's always entertaining, and I think that would be a fun thing to respond to. And maybe we'll even tag him in it to see if he responds to my response.
And said historically that there's no salvation outside of Eastern Orthodoxy. How do you make sense of that? And it was interesting that
I know it was addressed to Eastern Orthodoxy, but I can Catholicize it, I think.
Vast array of diverse answers that came into that. There isn't really a coherent singular response. There's lots of different responses. And I'm just persuaded it's about as clear as we could hope for in her history that historically Eastern Orthodoxy has restricted salvation to herself. And that's only changed in more recent times. That's my thesis. That's just what I believe is true.
But that's what Catholics also have done. Catholics and Orthodox believe we're exclusive. You believe in exclusivity, unless you're now saying that Jewish people and Muslims are going to heaven. Are you saying that? Because if you are, that's an interesting development. And then it makes you wonder if that's what you're saying. Why aren't you saying that about the Catholics and the Orthodox? In Catholic theology, we're open not just for Jewish and Muslims to go to heaven. We're open to even atheists going to heaven. Are you going to go that far? I think there's a little hypocrisy here and a little bit of wordplay and rhetoric going on. Not heavy, but a little light.
Now, even if you didn't go that far, though, we can still recognize the divide is deep here, right? This is not like a conversion. If someone becomes Eastern Orthodox, this is not a conversion from like Baptist to Presbyterian or Presbyterian to Baptist or Methodist to Anglican or Anglican to Methodist, etc. It's not like they're saying to the rest of Christendom, you guys do church badly. What they say is, you're not doing church. So we don't have a Eucharist. Look at the 1672 Synod of Jerusalem to see what they say about it.
But the Catholics also agree with the Orthodox here. So in a way, your attack against Orthodoxy is also an attack against Catholicism. And Catholicism and Orthodoxy, on paper, have a lot more in common than we do when we actually try to merge. The Eastern Rite Mass is the most merged, is the most authentic, if you will, expression of ancient Christianity as it exists today in the Catholic Church. The next oldest will be the traditional Latin Mass. So traditional Latin Mass isn't actually that old, and it also isn't that traditional. It's a revamp. But the John Christensen Mass is an ancient Mass. And it's the same Mass, the exact same Mass that's said in a Greek Orthodox church, and even in some Russian Orthodox churches. So just keep that in mind.
About that. So, point is,
Possibly even some Coptic. I don't know if they also use the John Christensen, although I think they do.
divide is deep, and we are considered heretics. And so the movement, so in other words, this really matters. That's one reason, just to see the stakes, even apart from the material particular.
It kind of feels like, because Gavin came out really heavy against iconoclasm, the icons, and then came out really hard against Catholicism at about that same time. And he took a lot of backlash for being dishonest. It feels like to me what he's really saying is that, well, you guys are anathematizing us and you're calling us heretics, so therefore you're the heretics, and you don't accept us. It's not that we don't accept you; it's that you won't submit to us. So why should we submit to you? And that's really childish and really immature, and denies the history of how the divisions happened. There were bloody wars where both sides did a lot of damage to each other because of these divides. So, as much as you're trying for ecumenicalism or trying to unite Protestantism into one Protestant church, you still want your Protestantism to be the winner. You still think your version of Calvinistic Baptist is the way that all churches should be. So, in a way, you want to be the Pope, and you're not. And all the mainline and traditional Protestant, traditional meaning Reformation, where is my other hand? There it is. Reformation-based or original Protestants are the true Protestants, and they can just form one Protestant church. That ain't happening, buddy. You guys are disappearing because you want people to intellectually assent to things that they know are not true. And I know you're doing a lot of work to get them to move on climate change, get them to move on evolution. It ain't working. You have the neo-fundamentalists now. Like, you're not winning.
Issues that already helps us understand this is a serious divide. Now, the other reason it matters to pay attention to this is because it reflects real weakness in much contemporary Protestant practice that we need to address. So let me say it in one sentence.
Has Jay Dyer responded to Gavin Ortland's questionnaire?
Main idea of this video, the stability and the rigor that people are searching for right now. We need to help them find that in the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that is going to mean reform and renewal in our church practice. So that leads to the third question here. What do we do about this? How do we respond to this? The first thing is just we need to pay attention to this phenomenon. To me, it's unfortunate how much we sort of ignore different traditions within Christendom. There's still so much ignorance. And the online conversation, actually, for all the weaknesses of online communication, there are some benefits, and at least it is creating more discussion. Sometimes it's not always very productive. Sometimes it is. But at least there's more communication going on today than there was, 100 years ago. We need to pay attention to these conversations and to these trends and study these other traditions. To the next step. And here's the final thing I want to say in this video. And I say this a lot, and I say it, try not to be obnoxious to anybody out there. I say this because I really think people need to hear this. And
so we're going to go to Ascension Percent.
The human heart,
and then we'll
the need of the human
Randall
heart.
Rousseau, and we'll call it a
I'm going
night
to say
there.
the need right now for stability in a time of chaos is ultimately found in Jesus Christ himself and in his gospel. I think we need to interpret the particular needs of the moment through the framework of the gospel. What hearts are searching for right now is found in Jesus. Now, that does not displace the role of the church, and it does not sideline these conversations about church history and theology as unimportant. Those are all worthy conversations. That's why I devote so much time.
Yeah, but those are also places where you're losing your argument, and you're just entrenching yourself. So it seems like you're trying to move on. It's almost, and I'm not comparing you to I was going to call him Daryl Dix. What's his name? To Billy Carson. You obviously would destroy Billy Carson in a argument or in a debate, but you're pulling a Billy Carson. You're trying to move on to another issue because you're losing the issue that you're currently entrenched in.
Time to them. However, I do think this happens. It is possible to look to a church tradition to try to find stability in a particular historical expression when what we really should be looking to is Jesus himself. There is often a lack of gospel clarity and gospel assurance among those who are engaged in these conversations about church traditions. Take the imagery of rock and sand that came up from Trenham's book and from the article as well. What I would want to say to pastor young people who are seeking stability in a very chaotic time is, first of all, pointing them to the scripture. The solid rock beneath our feet is the Holy Scriptures, the words of...
Or it's Jesus himself. All right, let's move on.
Hello, everybody. My name is Father Mike Schmitz. I want to let you know about a one-night-only opportunity we have in Newark, New Jersey on Monday. That you never want to step the wrong way. You never want to say the wrong thing because this can be a really delicate thing to talk about. I think that is so good for us to meditate on death. In fact, my wordle word of the day, that's my word. That's my lead-off word is death. Not only because it has the E and the A and the TH, it's really, really helpful, but also because the first thing I want to think about every day is I want to think about my death. Memento mori, right? That remember your death. Remember that, here's the thing. Remember that this world is not your home. That we are passing, strangers and sojourners, that this is not our homeland. This is where we are right now in order to be where we're meant to be ultimately. That this world means something, but it's not our final destination. So I'm going to talk about death, specifically talking about how sometimes people struggle with death.
It's really amazing how his beard is completely gray, but yet somehow his hair is dark black. It's amazing to me. It's amazing to me that that's the case. It's like some kind of magic or something. Some kind of manly magic, like, you know what I'm saying?
In a way that shakes their faith. I remember when I first got here on campus and first started working with adolescents and college students, that I would hear this a lot. I would hear that here would be someone and they'd want to talk about someone in their life had died. And this might have been their first encounter with death, of someone that they were close to, their first encounter with death that really, broke their heart. I think sometimes when we encounter grief, someone might say, I want an answer, give me an answer. But the reality is, I don't think in those moments, A, there are too many answers. And B, I don't know if that's really what we really want. I think we just want to be able to express our sadness. We want to express our...
Yes, the widget took your comment, but the chat did not.
Grief, the fact that we're hurting, our loss. And just sometimes, like Job, just want someone to sit with me in my grief. But even if they say, give me an answer, why is this happening? Maybe it's best not to try to give an answer because most likely it's not going to be enough. And secondly, our answer is probably going to be wrong. If we say the answer is, well, it was their time, or because God knows best, or because he needed another angel in heaven, or whatever, those are all dumb answers. They don't help and they're not true. Well, that was a little rant, wasn't it? I think sometimes what they need is, they just need us to be there, right? In their grief. As I've walked with a lot of young people, with their first encounter with grief, with loss, and anger towards God.
I've noticed that a lot of people, and Grimes actually talked about this. She talked about some of the hardships she's been through since divorcing or separating from Elon. She talks about how her first big trials in her life came really late, and that when they came, they would have destroyed her if other big trials hadn't hit her. And I feel the same way. I think if my only trial in life was the death of my mom and the death of my sister, I think I would be real resentful about death. But the fact that my life has had so many trials, those don't even bother me anymore. Those are not things that I'm concerned about or that make me question my life or my faith or any of that kind of stuff. So, I don't know.
The sadness of losing the person, that's completely normal. But the anger towards God, I remember even this, here's a young person. They were in college, maybe their second or third year in college, and their grandmother had passed away. Their grandmother had died. And they wanted to meet a number of times because they were so racked by this. Now, yeah, of course, in grief, we just want to be present and all these things. Well, one of the things that was happening with them is that they were now mad at God. And they were saying, why did my grandma have to die? Because, she was maybe, I think like 89. So she's 89. She had more years to go. She was so fit before this, she was pretty healthy. Her mind was totally there. And they went on to say, and she loved Jesus so much. And she went to daily mass and she prayed a rosary all the time. She prayed for all of us. Like, why does God have to take her? And you can't say it in this moment. So I'm going to sing it now. This was years ago. You can never say it in the moment. So I'm saying it right now. You're mad at God for giving your grandma the one thing she wanted most. That how you described your grandma is someone who lived a long life, someone who prayed, someone went to mass regularly every day, someone who loved Jesus. And now she has Jesus. And you're mad at God that she now has the thing she most wanted. You're mad at God that now she has him, that she spent years of her life loving Jesus and longing for Jesus, and now she has Jesus, and you're mad at Jesus for giving her what she wants. Now, keep in mind, we can be sad. You can be sad that you don't have your grandmother anymore, or you don't have your spouse anymore, or you don't have your siblings or your friends.
That's one of the things about Christianity, especially in the Catholic and Orthodox traditions. When you go to a healing mass or you go to pray for the sick, supreme unction, you're not actually praying for healing. You're praying for a peaceful death, a glorious death, a death that gets you to heaven. And not even necessarily a peaceful death, although that is one of the things you pray for. You're praying that it's a glorified death, so that way you go to heaven. That's what you want. So it can't be self-deletion. It has to be God choosing you and then you passing. So that's your goal, is to be one with God, one with Jesus. So,
Or even, I know this happens, your children. That sadness is absolutely, completely understandable, and I'm not dismissing that at all. But to be mad at God that now the person you love has him. There's a scene in the book The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis, where it's the plains between heaven and hell, right? And people get a choice. They get to either go back to hell, or they can go follow the angel or the saint who's come to bring them to the Lord. They can go to heaven. And there's a scene where there's this mom, and she had lost her son. And she wanted him to come get her, because she wanted him. And you can imagine the grief that marked her life. They talk about the grief that marked her life. But in the course of this discussion, she says she would rather have her son with her in hell than her son to be happy without her in heaven. And C.S. Lewis, in the book, he's the one witnessing all this. It's kind of a vision that he has in the novel. And he says, I don't think I could ever go back and tell people that I saw this vision and that that's wrong, that there's something deficient about, or twisted about this particular mother's love for her child who passed away. And his guide looks at him and he says, he has a rather fierce look apparently, and he says, oh no, you couldn't. You're not a good enough man for that. So I think about that when I'm offering this message. I don't think that I'm a good enough person to be able to convey the truth of this to anyone who's listening, because I realize this is the truth. The truth is that grief can be overwhelming, and a broken heart can become a poisoned heart. And sometimes sadness can turn to anger. And sometimes our loss can be, we look for someone to blame. But to realize this truth, the truth is, I can miss them with all my heart. And at the same time know, but they have Jesus now. They have more than I could ever give them now. And am I really resentful over the fact that right now, again, your loved one right now is happy in heaven without you? Would you rather them to be less happy, to be sorrowful, to be in pain, and with you? Or do you love them enough to allow them to be happy without you in heaven? I'm not a good enough person to share this message, so I know it could be taken so wrong. I could be sounding like I'm saying it so wrong, and I don't mean to. But I think sometimes when we get angry at God over someone who's died in our lives, whether they're really old or really young or whatever the situation, the question we get to ask ourselves, maybe we have to ask ourselves, is what would I rather be true? Them to be happy with God without me, and only temporarily, because hopefully one day you'll join them, or with me in this valley of the shadow of death? What would I rather have?
Today, December 4th, 2024, the U.S. Supreme Court is discussing a case related to trans rights. And that prompted me to make this short video just to talk about 3 different issues with respect to the trans rights debate or the broader trans conversation. And I think these 3 topics are often obscured within what is often a very contentious matter of debate. So hopefully I can shed some light rather than generate more heat. The first point I want to make is that the most basic question we want to talk about at the outset, I would suggest, is not a question of one's philosophy of gender identity, but rather it's a therapeutic question. I think very often debate about trans issues begin with a very absolutist framing. Do you accept, for example, that trans women are women? And that gets into a whole philosophical discussion about how you understand gender, sex, whether there's a voluntaristic element to it, whether there's some degree of social construction, etc. Those are all important questions to have and debates to have.
sometimes it looks like he gets into fights, and I don't. Is someone like beating him up, or is he into like martial arts? I don't understand.
But they should not obscure from what is really the fundamental question here. The fundamental
I
question
remember one
seems
time it looked like he had a black eye. Like I'm just trying to figure out what's going on with him.
to me is the basic question, is that some people within the human population
And he kind of has a beard like a goatee like a pirate.
experience severe gender dysphoria. In other words, there is a misalignment between their birth sex, or if you prefer, their sex assigned at birth, and their gender identity. And this creates a sense of cognitive dissonance and emotional and psychological distress.
I think part of the problem that people have with Randall Rouser is that he capitulates on the use of language. So even if his points are salient, because he's using the woke language or woke vernacular while supposedly talking to more conservative Christians, I think that hurts his argument. That hurts his case.
And the question is, how therapeutically
You have to speak to people where they are and speak to people how they speak.
best do we address that sense of emotional and psychological distress that is caused by this misalignment between birth sex and gender identity? So it's a therapeutic question. How do you address the problem that these individuals are experiencing? And that's a question that you can seek to address whatever your philosophical views of the nature of gender and sex and how they relate to one another are, because it's just a separate question. It's a question of a therapeutic response to a subset of the population experiencing this sense of cognitive dissonance and suffering and trauma. The phenomena is, in some respects, similar to body integrity identity disorder, where a person feels like some aspect of their body is not really theirs. And I think it's fair to say that there's a dimension of that similar in issues of gender dysphoria. This is also, of course, to recognize that not every person who claims to have a misalignment between their birth sex and gender identity is actually experiencing gender dysphoria. There may be, for example, kids who are influenced by others within their culture to say, or their friend group, to want to be different and to, for
But I also think part of the problem is that for a long while now, for over 10 years, you aren't allowed to even speculate this, even if you were on the side of trans rights. If you speculated this, you would be canceled, you would be hated, you'd be demonized. So even speculation on this and conversation on this aspects were not allowed. This is how people like Blair White and other who used to be trans activists became more and more red pilled until they ended up going to the right. So I think it's a little dishonest to act as if it's just one side refusing to compromise. It's another side refusing to listen, and that being pushed out puts more and more rigid views on the opposing side. Although there's a whole background and backbone to that rejection of the new ideology from the more traditional, more conservative side. But all you have to do is reject that new ideology for the conservative side to at least welcome you in with somewhat open arms.
a temporary period in their life to adopt some particular gender identity that does not align with their birth sex, but they're not gender dysphoric. So I can recognize that there are such people as that, while also recognizing that there is legitimate gender dysphoria, and we have to think therapeutically, how do we address it? So that's the first question. Again, it kind of sidesteps the whole philosophical debate about whether trans women are women, trans men are men, etc. The next issue is the fact that we can have both a priori.
It seems there's a philosophical, spiritual, if you will, and political aspect to this, regardless of the science. And I think that makes the conversation so much more complicated and so much more ugly.
Principal
On both
responses
sides, on all sides.
to this issue, and also a posteriori or empirical responses to the issue. In other words, some people believe that certain responses to gender dysphoria are in principle inadvisable, unjustified, no matter what the possible outcomes of those treatments could be. Whether this could be the use of puberty blockers in children or a more radical invasive surgery for children or for adults, some people would a priori be closed off to any of those as therapeutic responses to gender dysphoria, irrespective of whatever the outcomes might be. Other people would not be a priori closed to those as possible therapeutic responses. Rather, they would want to see evidence for good outcomes. So if it were the case, let's say that 100 out of 100 people who had invasive gender sex reconstruction surgery to align with their understanding of their gender, if 100 out of 100 of those people had favorable outcomes, then those who have an a posteriori response to this issue would say, well, that's good evidence that we ought to pursue that kind of response to gender dysphoria. Other people, it doesn't matter in other cases in the a priori response. how many positive cases you get if they're in principle closed to puberty blockers or to invasive surgeries.
But here you're framing it in a particular direction instead of using a more neutral framing, which should be more acceptable to both sides.
Then it just doesn't matter. The empirical evidence doesn't matter. So the second thing then is it's important for everybody to be upfront about whether they are a posteriori, in principle, open to empirical evidence favors particular therapeutic responses based on outcomes. And if not, if you're not in principle open to those as possible responses, then why not? And you can have a conversation.
But I think the data not supporting one particular side, especially look at the data coming out of Australia and coming out of the UK, only entrenches those who already have an a priori conclusion. And it's pushing more people who see the inconsistency with their, I think you call it post priori, whatever, after the fact opinions. So you gotta, at some point, the facts just matter.
About whether you should be open in principle or not to those kinds of therapeutic responses. The last question that I think we should be thinking about is if we are in principle or a posteriori open empirically to looking at the evidence for favorable outcomes based on particular therapeutic responses.
But again, just because you're open to it doesn't mean you're going to get the result. That's what I was trying to say.
Then the next question is this: how good does the evidence have to be? If there were, let's say, surgeries that were done on 100 people who had gender dysphoria to realign their bodies more closely with their understanding of their gender identity.
I think Adam and Stitch answered this pretty soundly when they said all it has to do is be 51%. As long as 51% are positive results, that's good enough for most people. If you're trying to get the conservatives to move, I mean, you're going to have to be over 90%. You're trying to get Christians to move, you're going to have to be maybe over 100%. So, I mean, it just depends on what audience you're trying to move. You're just talking about the voting public. I think 51% positive cases will get people to move. I think even 75% positive cases will get people to move. But you got to understand that means that there's 49% negative cases, or there's 25% negative cases, and that is still going to be a factor in most people's minds, especially if it's their daughter or their son on the firing line. So just be aware of that. And since the numbers don't reflect that, that's even a harder case to make.
If there were 100 of those surgeries, 99 of them had favorable outcomes even after 20 or 30 years, but one of them, that person regretted their decision, then how would you weigh the satisfaction of the 99 versus the dissatisfaction of the one? And I think that at this point,
this goes back to your own quote, which is a quote that I also believe in and agree with, which is it's better to let 99 guilty men go free than to let one innocent man suffer. But if you're going to be consistent with the principle, which I know some people are now calling consistency a fallacy, but let's not get into that. I think that does become problematic when you're trying to use this type of reasoning to justify a particular ideology, or in this case, a progressive or woke cause.
Something like the trolley problem is at play for many people, whether they recognize it or not. You probably know the trolley problem, but in case you don't, here's a quick recap of it. So it's a thought experiment, and the thought experiment is meant to tease out the different intuitive responses that we have to the moral obligations of non-intervention versus intervention. So imagine that you're on a trolley. The brakes aren't working, and it's hurtling down the tracks. And there are 5 people on the tracks ahead of you. And if you do nothing, and you can't stop the trolley, but
hold on, because the way that he says it is very biased. So the traditional way of making someone think is, okay, complete strangers. There's 5 people on one, and there's 1 person on the other track. Which one do you save? And you go, okay, the 5. And almost everybody in the room agrees, except for maybe a class clown. And you say, okay, now the 1 person is your best friend, or your grandmother, or your mom, or your kid. And the other people are strangers. And everyone goes, oh, okay, well, now the strangers. Okay. Now, the people on the 5 people are people that are bad people, and now the good person is a stranger, but they're all bad people you know. Now who do you save? You don't know if that guy's a good guy or a bad guy. That's a stranger. But the other ones you know are bad. Now who do you choose? So that's how the trolley problem is supposed to work. Randall Rousseau comes up with a slightly different formalization that prevents you from having the full realization of what the trolley problem is supposed to expose in your reasoning, that you're biased to the people that you know and to the people that you like. And you're biased against the stranger. Even though at first, when it's just pure utilitarian, it makes sense.
If you do nothing and don't intervene in any way, then the trolley will kill those 5 people. But you do have one option, and the one option is to flip a switch on the trolley, which will put it onto a sidetrack, which will spare the lives of those 5 people. But as a result, will kill one person who's on that siding, that alternative track. Then the question is, which do you do? Do you do nothing and result in 5 people dying, or do you intervene, put it on another?
And then you can even have fun with the problem by putting different levels of evil people in the 5 people that are innocent. And you can just have a lot of fun with the trolley problem.
Track and result in one person dying. And that heightens the intuitive sense we have, for many people at least, that there is something more required in terms of intervention. Because many people have a sense that it would be wrong to intentionally put the trolley onto the other track that would kill that one person. Because in a sense, you are now intentionally killing that person.
No, that's wrong. Most people choose to kill the one and save the many. It's only when you start changing who that one person is or who the 5 people are that the formula begins to change. You make the person someone who they know to be historically evil, they're going to pick the 5. You pick someone who they care about, their mother, their grandmother, someone who they love, they're going to pick the 1 over the 5.
Versus doing nothing and allowing the 5 people to die and stayed on the original track. And that is the intuitive contrast between those different intuitions when it comes to intervention versus non-intervention, and whether a favorable outcome has to be that much higher in order to justify intervention versus non-intervention.
And based on the way that I explained it, and based on the way that most people understand the trolley problem, that means that most people will pick to protect their potential future child over endangering, or over the fact that they're endangering strangers, because they want to protect their genetics, their genes. The selfish gene is at work here. They want to survive, so their child is going to be more important.
And if you do have those intuitions, favorable outcomes have to be very much higher in order to justify intervention. That will feed into how you reason about the justification for intervention in the cases of gender dysphoria that we're talking about as well. Because in that case, perhaps even if mere 1% of people are dissatisfied ultimately with the choice, you might still think that the very action originally was unjustified because of that 1%. That's enough to overwhelm even the favorable outcomes of the other 99%. We should all be clear on what our intuitions are here, so that will just help us further the conversation.
I've already answered this question to you like a million times back when we used to debate. I told you it just depends on the kid, and I'd probably pick the kid if it's mine. If the test tubes are mine, I'm picking the test tubes, and kid's done for. Depends which one's mine. If it's all mine, the living kid. If the test tubes are mine and the kid is not mine, I'm choosing the test tubes. If the kid's mine and the test tubes aren't mine, I'm choosing the kid. I'm just checking to see if there's anything else I want to talk about before I call it a night. Oh, I think we're good. I think that's everything. Yeah, I think that's everything. I was going to do this, but now I don't really care about that because things have moved on. Okay, yeah, we're done for tonight, guys. Let me go ahead and go to the big screen, and then we'll go to the music. BS, thank you for joining today. It was very good seeing you. Santiago, it was good seeing you. Thomas, it was good seeing you. Yes, the algorithm seems to be messing with my channel again. So what? I'm going to keep making videos while I can. Please watch the video I did on Billy Carson It was a good video, and it was more honest, more raw, if you will, more blunt than I usually am in those kind of debate videos. Most debate videos, I try not to let my biases show, but this was such a bad debate, and his performance was so bad. It was like the D'Souza debate, where I just had to like say, look, this guy's not qualified. Carson and the supposed host, Mark, were not qualified to be in this conversation, and Will Huff smoked them. I mean, he destroyed their arguments completely and did it very well. And he did it the right way. He didn't. I would love to have the patience of that man, because when Mark was going off, I was just like, Will Huff is amazing. He has amazing patience, and the fact that he let them destroy their own arguments and then said, well, what's your source for that? Okay, where'd you get that from? Well, explain to me what you mean by that. Explain to me where that's from. Tell me the story in your words. That was brilliant. He completely demolished them without having to say anything, just by asking intelligent and, to be fair, leading questions. So that was beautiful. If you find a way to watch the original debate, go watch it while it's still available. And that's it. I will be doing a Trent Horn review. And I got other things going on right now. So if I'm seen distracted, it's because I am. And I will be trying to do more Sectorum Sermanums. I'll try to be doing more of them. I don't know if I'm going to keep doing it. Depends on how the audience share goes. Right now, I'm getting a pretty good audience share there, so I might keep doing it. All right. Talk to you all later. Have a great night. Bye. Here comes the music.
Yeah, it's our time to shine. Show that's the kind of state of mind you gotta combine with hard work and time. You gotta climb to the top. Don't let yourself drop till your heart stops. Let this beat rock. Got a new clock and a new stock for this new rock. Just let your mind loose from the new stock. Drunk off the goose, yeah, thinking that